It's not often these days that a custom knife like this passes through my channel. Making the script for this review has been a long, slow process, and I'm going to say that's because I didn't see the appeal initially in this knife and buy it for myself. This is actually a friend's knife, so it's been tough forming a clear opinion on it. The flip side of this is I can write a review from a completely objective perspective. I think we all know how it is to buy something with some expectation, and once we get it, our judgment is influenced by our preconceptions. And because of this, we can miss out on appreciating what the creator or artist has envisioned. But it's always important to realize that these people, such as Mr. ADV, they live and breathe their trade. So hypothetically, we have to respect that and realize that they're the ones who should have a wider perspective, on knife making, on knives, and what's more ingenuitive or artistically more sound and better. Now, keep in mind, during this review, I don't follow the custom knife world like some YouTube colleagues. My reviews look at how the concept was implemented, considering factors such as cost and labor and the knife's capabilities in specific scenarios. One unique feature that this knife has is a proprietary pivot design. You can see it on this side actually. And I am going to tinker with that on camera to clarify a little bit its function. Now, I haven't EDC'd this knife. This is how it comes, minus all the fingerprints. I apologize for that. But I've come a long way in my experiences, I think over almost 300 now videos. To some degree, I can make an assessment on each design aspect and how it would function. And it is a combination of things that makes this knife so unique. It's got great value for the cost if you're an American buyer. Lots of craftsmanship that equates to this being at the level of custom cutlery compared to the majority of US company offerings, production knives like Spydercos, etc. And it's built incorporating many of the best tactical features seen in high-end, tactical folders. So I searched this knife prior to this review and watched two great reviews by Darkchild57 and Terrafanatic. And the main thing that people on YouTube are talking about is the value you're getting here. But when you look at value, it means we're gauging both the money and time that was put into making this product. And reviewers talk about value, but they don't ever mention how much that actually costs the maker or company. And if we don't know that, then our perception of the product and maker can be incorrect. With custom knives, we have to look at how it was made. For example, cleaning up machine cut pieces versus stock removal to actually create the shape. In the case of the Butcher, you are getting a ton of value if you're comparing this to other knives in the American market and what you could spend. And that has a lot to do with the currency exchange value for dollars to South African Rand. So Mr. ADV can invest a lot of time into these. The titanium is very thick, but it has a bevel going all around the handle that's created using technique on top of technique to create this sort of semi-round. You can kind of see on that bevel right there, it's not just a clean 45, it's got a little bit more going on. And same goes with the finishing work. The machine milling here is done in steps, and then the contour is shaped, and anywhere that a bevel could be, for example, even here, and even on the actual little milled out parts, you see there's a bevel here. So there's a lot of detail, and you're basically getting every bell and whistle. You have a Hinder lock bar stabilizer, which looks custom, and then you have a customized pivot. You have the bearings inside. You have jimping in 3 locations. You can see the lines from the hand sanding. Kind of drops off a little bit there. So you can see here, the blade continues that sort of visible sanding, and then it moves on to, you have a different here. You got the more of a polished on the actual blood groove, your higher polish. Now it's not perfect. Every reviewer online has stated there are some slight cosmetic, just small stuff like scratches and maybe a scuff. It's titanium, bead blasting, perhaps just through exporting, travel, those little things happen. So the inconsistency for the mid-tech here, you can see, for example, in the lanyard hole in there, the scales don't match up with the hole for the backspacer part. On this side of the blade, you can see there's a blemish right there, up on this top part. And then the flat here, the swedge wasn't ground. They didn't grind off all of that flat right there. You can see on this side, it just cuts, you know, just from this bevel, just cuts into now the blood groove. On this side, it's the bevel, then a flat, then it cuts in the blood groove. No one can really speak for it unless you got a ton of skill and you're also a knife maker, and it is something that tough to try to match up, especially these straight lines. I don't know if people realize this, but keeping everything straight, is more challenging than doing a curve, because you have to have 3 straight lines. Everything has to be parallel. And pocket clip and overall action are all done exceptionally well. The lockup on this one especially has no tolerance issues. There's no real like pushing it in. If you grip it really hard or even give it a hard shake open, it's not going to hyper engage because there's no flexing. This pin isn't moving. These scales are thick enough. Everything is sturdy enough so that it always locks up the same way every time. And when you grip the knife, it does feel like there is no flex. It's most comparable to like a sniper blade works and how those are so overbuilt. Those are a little bit more solid feeling. Having a lock bar stabilizer means that this lock bar is supported from moving that direction when gripped hard. It's a feature usually you see on hard to use tactical folders like a Hinder. The Butcher's pocket clips works really well. At least I find that to be true. And depending on the kind of clothes you wear, this knife doesn't feel heavy and its profile isn't bulky, surprisingly. It does have a very flat sort of feel overall. I would say that the action is moderately smooth, but you can still feel the sort of metal, the movement of those bearings. I can show this right now on camera. That's how the action is right now. The grub screw has a really nice tolerance. Now here it's already loosened. And it's the same. It isn't adjusting the overall, tension of the pivot. So you're not going to get a smoother action. It's not for adjusting that. So realistically then, you can see now the grub screws almost out. The action is still the same. So it's not really sort of a thing now for user adjustment. It's not going to give you a looser or tighter action. That is still going to be determined by how tight you have the male screw tightened. The purpose of the grub screw is you can tighten the grub screw down to pin that female in place, so that when you do start to tighten the male screw, you have obviously the other side will stay stationary, allowing you to tighten it more to a more degree than normally you would be able to, but it would be to this sort of point where you can still do that. Now normally the action is not like that. It's much smoother. So this design does make the male screw a little bit narrower. So if you're thinking for like heavy use, prying, though the size of this pivot is substantial from the outside, and I would say the female, obviously is quite sturdy. The male has a very kind of a narrow body portion, so I wouldn't pry with it. I don't think it's overbuilt enough. The screw quality of the grub screw and also this pivot generally are very good, but the issue here now, unfortunately, is still that these body screws are still very small. And while the grub screw is a hex shape, and then the actual male and female are Torx, the body screws are also Torx, but they're a little bit loose if I use this Benchmade tool here. So some more precise tools are going to be necessary if you are thinking that you would take this thing apart. But regardless, this is kind of how the action is, and it is smooth, it's good. The lockup is solid, and again, that's something you can adjust, but even right now, With this sort of action and that smoothness, it's rock solid. Regardless though, deployment speed doesn't really mean anything, and it's just something for collectors and YouTubers to rant about. One thing to consider though is if you are thinking of importing this to your country and you're not allowed to have one-hand opening folders or ones that can be gravity shaken, this one won't get through customs. And that's the only reason why I know that messing with all this and tightening everything down as much as possible, the blade will still be able to gravity shake, at least probably to that point. But again, talk about action makes a knife seem like it doesn't have anything more to it, but that's not the case here. This knife has a unique blade. It's a high hollow, so it pushes in really well. But then it becomes a little bit challenging because it is such a tall blade, you can't really like adjust your cut. So you do kind of have to cut straight. So it feels kind of like a butcher's knife minus the weight and feel of chopping. Whether that's functional or not will depend on obviously your purposes. The blood groove here isn't applicable because you're not stabbing with this sort of sheep's foot blade. This knife could be called a tactical folder because it incorporates many of the features of modern tactical knives. You know, you got the stabilizer disc, you got overbuilt pivot, you know, hard cut jimping on the top portions, you got backspacers, you got raised jimping, you got the flipper guard, it's a frame lock. All these things go way beyond what's necessary to have in a utility knife. But if you are thinking along the lines for that purpose specifically, then I don't think this is the preferable tactical knife when judging it based on that. It has polished surfaces which do reflect, although there are other alternatives, and you could technically, I guess, have it sandblasted or modified. And I've heard that he's very willing to customize your order. The knife also has a deep carry. Another thing that makes it less optimal for easy deployment, you know, in a defensive situation, but it is great for EDC. And the bulk of the cutting blade here for utility purposes isn't accessible for food or kitchen. You can see when you hold it, pretty much you're only cutting with the tip. So when you're doing pull cuts, you know, it would have benefited from a curved blade, at least if you wanted more function. And a curved blade would allow it to sit further into the handle and you wouldn't have this sort of protrusion sticking out. And the flipper, while it does work, you kind of have to do it with some intention. It's not a knife that would deploy without like second thought, and you are kind of limited to using the flipper to open or gravity shaking it, although doing this is possible. And last thing overall, for utility purposes, you know, all the jimping right here, and this sort of stiff shape, if you guys can see, it does have hot spots that would form over a long period. But for custom knife makers, their products are more about artistry, and you know, they have to differentiate themselves from the market. These designs go way beyond just making a thin piece of metal sharp and functional. And this knife is tactical, but I would still say it's a light duty EDC knife. Now why would you need that is up to you to decide.